Richard Wayne Penniman, known to the world as Little Richard, was born on December 5, 1932, in Macon, Georgia. He grew up in a big family with 12 siblings. Money was tight and life was not easy, but Richard had one thing that stood out: his voice. Even as a child, his voice was so loud and unique that neighbors could hear him sing from blocks away. At home, Richard was shy, but on the streets and in church he came alive. His singing in the church choir made people stop and listen. His father didn't like Richard's wild personality and often scolded him for acting different. Yet Richard couldn't hide who he was. He loved flashy clothes, loud music, and showing off his talent. Deep down, Richard knew he was meant for something big. The shy boy with the loud voice was ready to change music forever. By his teenage years, Richard was sneaking into clubs and performing whenever he got the chance. He worked at odd jobs, but music was always calling him. He was heavily influenced by gospel singers, blues musicians, and performers who weren't afraid to be bold. He learned how to work a crowd, dancing, screaming, and pounding the piano like it was on fire. He called himself Little Richard because of his small frame, but there was nothing small about his personality. People noticed him because he wasn't afraid to be different. He wore makeup, shouted lyrics, and had a style no one had seen before. Still, the big record labels didn't take him seriously. They thought he was too wild. Richard didn't care. He knew one day the world would catch up to his energy. His time was coming, and it would explode like a rocket. In 1955, Little Richard walked into a recording studio in New Orleans, and history was about to be made. He sat at the piano and shouted out a wild song he had been performing live, Tutti Frutti. The lyrics were crazy, the beat was fast, and his voice was electrifying. The producers almost didn't know what to do with it, but they cleaned up the words and released it. The result, a worldwide hit. Tutti Frutti didn't just top the charts, it changed the sound of music. With its wild energy, it broke the line between rhythm blues and rock and roll. Teenagers loved it, parents hated it, and suddenly Little Richard was everywhere. His outrageous stage presence, jumping on pianos, screaming at the top of his lungs, made him unforgettable. This was not just a song, it was the birth of rock and roll's raw spirit, and Little Richard was the spark. After Tutti Frutti, the hits kept coming. Songs like Long Tall Sally, Rip It Up, and Lucille made Little Richard a superstar. His concerts were wild parties where fans screamed, fainted, and rushed the stage. He was unpredictable, sometimes climbing on top of pianos, sometimes running off stage mid-performance. His makeup, glittery suits, and wild hair shocked people in the 1950s, but teenagers adored him. For the first time, black and white audiences came together in the same venues to see him perform. Little Richard wasn't just making music, he was breaking barriers. Rock and roll was shaking the culture, and Richard was at the center of it all. He called himself the architect of rock and roll, and no one could argue. Every song he played lit a fire that inspired young musicians everywhere. Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, and even a young Paul McCartney were watching closely. By the late 1950s, Little Richard was one of the biggest names in the world. But behind the glitter and fame, he struggled. Growing up in a religious household, he often felt guilty about his wild lifestyle. He was torn between his love for gospel and his role as a rock and roll star. During a tour in Australia in 1957, he suddenly announced he was quitting rock music to dedicate his life to God. Fans were shocked. Richard went to Bible school and even became a preacher, but the fire of rock and roll never left him. He would go back and forth between the church and the stage many times in his life. This inner struggle made Richard unique. He was both a preacher and a wild rock and roll pioneer, and the world wasn't done with him yet. By the 1960s, rock and roll had exploded around the world, and many of the new stars credited Little Richard as their inspiration. The Beatles in particular loved him. They even toured with him in Europe, learning stage tricks and vocal styles directly from him. Seeing how much he influenced the new generation, Richard couldn't resist returning to the spotlight. His shows in the 60s were louder, crazier, and more flamboyant than ever. He wore brighter clothes, screamed higher notes, and reminded the world that he was still the king of rock and roll energy. Even though new stars were rising, Richard never lost his spark. He was a pioneer, and he wasn't about to let anyone forget it. Little Richard's music shaped the sound of some of the biggest legends in history. Elvis Presley covered his songs. James Brown called him a hero. Jimi Hendrix, who once played guitar in Richard's band, said he learned showmanship from watching him. The Beatles borrowed his screaming vocals, and the Rolling Stones learned how to work a crowd from him. Even decades later, artists from Prince to Michael Jackson carried pieces of Richard's flamboyant style. He didn't just influence music, he influenced fashion, performance, and culture. Rock, soul, funk, and pop all carried his fingerprints. Richard was proud of this, often reminding interviewers, "I am the architect of rock and roll." He wasn't lying. Without Little Richard, the sound of modern music would not exist. Even though Little Richard inspired generations, he often felt underappreciated. Many white rock stars made fortunes singing his songs, while Richard sometimes struggled financially. He spoke openly about how unfair the music industry could be to black artists. In interviews, he demanded credit for what he created, reminding the world that he had been there first. He was bold, unapologetic, and sometimes controversial, but he never let people erase his place in history. Over time, he began receiving awards, honors, and inductions into halls of fame. But Richard always believed the recognition came late. Still, his voice never wavered. He always shouted proudly about his role in building the foundation of rock. In his later years, Little Richard slowed down but never stopped shining. He continued performing into his 70s, though with less wild energy. He became a symbol of rock's beginnings, a living legend. Younger audiences who had never seen him in the 50s now watched him in awe, realizing they were in the presence of history. In 2020, at the age of 87, Little Richard passed away. The world mourned, but also celebrated the man who gave rock and roll its heart and soul. His final years were filled with love, respect, and recognition that he had fought for his entire life. Little Richard may be gone, but his spirit lives in every scream, every wild piano riff, and every performer who dares to be bold. His legacy is not just in the songs he recorded, but in the energy he gave to music forever. Without him, there would be no Beatles, no Stones, no Prince, no rock and roll as we know it. He showed the world that music should be loud, fun, and fearless. The shy boy from Macon grew into a legend who changed culture itself, and that's why even today, when people talk about the roots of rock, one name always comes first: Little Richard, the true architect of rock and roll.